Welcome to Black Unquiet Minds, the podcast that amplifies the voices of individuals from diverse backgrounds as they bravely share their stories, struggles, and hopes for a better future. I'm your host, Marius Lancaster, and in each episode, we delve into the depths of intersectional identities and the challenges faced by those living in America. Today, I'm excited to introduce you all to tonight's guest and my personal friend, Sansare Cobbs, current student studying agriculture at The Ohio State University. I had the pleasure of meeting Sansare through her sister during my time working in the medical marijuana industry as a dispensary agent for Bloom Medicinals in Columbus, Ohio. While still focusing on her final semesters of study, Sansare is now taking the opportunity to engage with her entrepreneurial spirit in the hopes to fund her business, Agfro LLC, a company focused on hemp, both understanding the cultivation and processing of hemp, with the products she is hoping to produce and manufacture being agricultural plastic, textiles, and sustainable clothing. I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to sit down with me here and to discuss some of your journey thus far, especially considering the traveling you had to do today to make it into the studio, coming all the way down from Columbus. Please tell the audience and I both more about how you came up with the idea for Agfro and some of your thoughts about trying to break out as a young woman of color in the field of agriculture.
So I was taking a class last semester called entrepreneurship, and I took a couple business classes to round out the last things I needed for my bachelor's degree. And the semester before that, I took a class of advanced agriculture, just touching on different sorts of topics that are going on in the world. I mean, a lot of the times we focus on what goes on in the United States. This kind of took a broader topic and looked at agriculture in different places. Like, for example, Africa, they're growing rice because they have evolved how they grow rice, and they're able to do it in certain parts of Africa. So that's actually kind of cool. In Bangladesh, what they used to do when it flooded, they had mats of like this thick algal substance, and they'd cut into it and try to make a surface, and they actually grew vegetables and not necessarily fruits because trees would be too big, but they grew food on those like algal mats. They put compost and soil into it. But where I got the idea from was in that class I was looking into, well, there's agriculture plastic, which you actually have to lay down and then at the end of the season rip back up because it's not biodegradable, and you don't want that just floating around in your soil. Mm-hmm. I mean, and it can clog up the tiller machine. I mean, could be, depending on what kind of practice you're doing. I mean, if you get in there, it could be unsafe, or you could actually damage the machine, and what have you. But if you'd have an agricultural plastic that you didn't have to remove, it would just biodegrade into the soil, and then you can amend it so that, hey, it would put nutrients in the soil, like a pesticide, or like slow release IPM, or like integrated pest management, and let eggs hatch and fight off whatever pest that might be trying to kill your crops. So I kind of, fast forwarding to the entrepreneurship class last semester, we were tasked to make a product. Mm-hmm. And after a lot of thought and then trying to pivot from what we were thinking of initially, our group came up with snapping socks. So they were snaps built on sewn into the sides of socks. And that way, in the washing machine and the dryer, they would stay together. And you could fold them that way. So all you had to do was just snap them when you were done wearing them and throw them in the hamper.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And when I tell you, that was a nervous experience. Like, I don't mind public speaking, mm-hmm. but that was a nervous experience because the group before us, I like the idea. It was a great idea, but the panel of people, because it was different professors, or I guess different experts in business, were really thorough in asking, like, trying to find every single nook and cranny and ask every single question and trying to make sure they knew their product inside and out. But when we went up for our product, they're like, that would be so helpful. I'm like, millennial problems, millennial solutions. I mean,
yeah.
But I was like, okay, I could apply that to a different class I was in the same semester, and we had to do a term paper. Mm-hmm. And the goal of the term paper was find a real plot of land And imagine you built a farm. What would you put on it? Would you build a greenhouse? What would be the expenses for it? What kind of crops would be there? Would you have livestock? It had to have a logo, a name, and a business plan, essentially.
Okay.
So that's really where the idea for AgFro got put together. Like that was where I guess it started. It ended a nuance, but then started the idea. So yeah, and then with hemp clothing, the thing is, we don't really know. I mean, we know, but our clothing really isn't biodegradable either. I mean, with the dyes and when I say biodegradable, I mean when it breaks down, it doesn't put any sort of toxins back into the soil.
Okay.
Because composting, what you do is you just use plant matter. So essentially, as long as it's not diseased plant matter, you can use it and then put it back on top of the soil, and that'll biodegrade and give the soil nutrients for the plants to grow.
Right.
That's why I use manure sometimes as well. But I digress. So yeah, that's where the idea started. And it's just, I was taking 15 credit hours last semester, and I was just like, you know what? I'm going to try to utilize every single thing I learned in every class and try to cross-use it just to see what happens. I'm like, man, I can get this done, and the paper only had to be 5 pages long. Mine ended up, it was 13, and then I trimmed it down to 9 because I was like, I don't want to read 13 pages. I'm not going to make my professor read that either. So, but that's where the idea came from.
Okay, gotcha. No, that's definitely really interesting to hear about, especially just getting into the historical background of kind of how other cultures were really using and utilizing their different plants and their different tools, and the way that you've kind of, if anything, used old tools and old practices to kind of solve a modern day issue. I feel like sometimes we definitely make things a lot more complicated than they are, and we can just look at our past that can really inform our future as well as our present. And I think even looking at something as simple as agriculture and the way that we actually grow our produce, there's still so many things that we can learn from other cultures in our past that I think we don't often take into consideration when we are trying to solve problems these days. And especially considering the cultural aspect of it, and knowing that you had to, like you said, talk about different African countries and the way that they were looking at rice and things like that. Knowing that in that diversity, in looking at these other cultures, in understanding that there are people doing similar things to what we are here in the States, but are just doing them in different ways, and that we can implement their different styles. Do you feel like in your, field of study in agriculture, especially right now in modern day agriculture, that there are more people willing to look at other cultures and look at the ways that agriculture and horticulture is being studied and practiced in other cultures? Or do you feel like, as a woman of color in that space, just because sometimes it's easier to feel kind of other or feel like you don't belong, that it's easier for you to want to implement these practices that are being done in different cultures and in different parts of the world?
Honestly, I've been in school for 6 years. Going through the 6 years of college, I haven't seen many people of color, period, in agriculture. I mean, I remember seeing a few professors, a young woman named Catherine, and maybe a couple other people. But then as the years went on, COVID happened. We're going back into, in-person class. I noticed more people of color. So, but in some of the other classes I've taken, like the turf grass class, I took like engines and transmissions class, there aren't other women in there. I mean, I met Ellie. She's really, really nice, and she is the only woman in the ag systems degree at the moment. It's all men. So yeah, doing that, I see more women in my field. There's a lot of women in the horticulture industry. I mean, everywhere in every class. I'm just like, oh man, this class outweighs women to men. There's 80% women, 20% men. Maybe there's 20% men in this class. So even in the sustainable agriculture class, and that's a fun class because the last semester, last year, not last semester, but last year in the fall, I took that class the second time because I took it 2 years ago as well. And there was me, two other young Korean people. I think they were Korean. The Hispanic guy, and the Egyptian guy, and the Middle Eastern guy. And then there were white people as well. And it was just like, wow, there are a lot of people of different backgrounds, different cultures in this class, and we did so much good work in that class.
Mm-hmm.
There was this banquet going on for, I think, the dean of the agricultural college, and they were kind of running into an issue with what they could get from the student farm, because the student farm wasn't really growing like leafy greens for salads and stuff. They were growing corn and other more like hardy type things, which is fine. I mean, they were growing pumpkins, and they used those pumpkins for a whole slew of things on there, but I digress. So we were growing kale and broccoli and spinach and other sorts of stuff. So we harvested a whole bunch of stuff for their banquet, and it was really fun because, I mean, we built raised beds, we put in transplants, we direct seeded. Someone ran the rototiller and actually used like a 2-wheel tractor. So, but we all did this as a group. And I mean, it's just kind of interesting to see how we all can come from different places, but then come together and actually see the quotation fruits of our labor, because they're technically vegetables. They're not fruit. But fun fact, peppers are fruits.
Okay, all right. Yeah, that's definitely a fun fact and not something that I would have proudly said out loud until this moment. But no, like hearing that, that's like awesome. When I think about all of the classes that I've gotten the most from, regardless of what we were doing, I feel like having the opportunity of having individuals of different backgrounds, and sometimes, yes, that does come with the cultural aspect of the race or ethnicity, but sometimes it can come through socioeconomic status or just walks of life. There are definitely a lot of people, when we think about intersectional identities, that can bring things to the table, into the conversation, no matter what that conversation is surrounding. Just based on their background and their experiences. And from what I'm hearing about your classes and some of your takeaways is just by having those individuals that had those different experiences and that had those separate perspectives, it just kind of enriched that experience for you overall. And I'm wondering, do you know of anything, I guess, personally that you've seen in the agriculture space? You know, you talked about in horticulture there being more women than men into the field. With any field, I feel like we definitely want to kind of get to a balance or an equilibrium. I know that's certainly hard when there are just certain gender roles and structures in our society that are at play that have, spanned generations at this point. But when I think about finding that equilibrium or that balance for the industry, do you think there's anything that can be done in horticulture or in agriculture to really balance out or to get more of a equal, perspective and experience for everyone, regardless of your gender or your ethnicity or, whatever that is that you subscribe to that kind of puts you in that box?
Sure. There are men in different classes. Like, in horticulture, I guess there's a lot of different things going on. Because you can have agronomy, you can have entomology, you can have plant pathology. I see a lot of men in turf grass, because that's like golf courses, lawn management there, but that also kind of, I guess, relates to tractors, which is ag systems management, which that's what Ellie's a part of. But in horticulture, like, you get all the everything. Like, floriculture is flowers, entomology is bugs, which I had to take a few insect classes, and I tell you, the first and last class, it was online, and I was listening to the lecture, and I'm just like, And then a spider popped up and scared me, and it was over from then. So yeah, that was the end of my entomology trip. But plant pathology, took a couple classes with that, and that's actually a nice, like, even keel of men and women in there, and it's nice. We got to work in groups and try to figure out what was affecting certain plants that we were given. They were just 14 random plants. There were a bunch of groups. We were all given 2. Go have fun. What is it? I was like, okay. So, yep, we had to document what we were doing. And the other classes that are kind of like, they're not elective classes, but you take them to fulfill, in my case, to fulfill my minor. And one was like advanced horticulture. There was weed ID. So you had to figure out, not turfgrass weeds, because turfgrass was its own class, but you had to figure out like broadleaf weeds and a couple grass-like weeds. There were prostrate weeds or vining weeds. There were like the succulent ones, the ones you see outside with the red fleshy stem and the kind of like ovular teardrop or raindrop green, like evergreen leaves. They're really little, really close to the ground.
Yep.
That's called purslane. It's actually edible.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Again, another fun fact I would not have known.
Right. There's this account on Instagram. I was talking to Nicole about this, and she was like, "Yeah, they're called. I think it's called Black Forager." And she's from Columbus, but she goes out and she goes and IDs these things, saying, "Oh yeah, this is safe to eat. This isn't safe to eat." And I'm just like, that is such a great use of everything. So I need to watch that. I want to meet this person. That would be awesome.
I don't know if it's the same woman that I think there was a black forager. She would identify like mushrooms and things like that.
Yeah, that's the same person.
Oh, okay. Because I was gonna say, even I, like, back when I was on social media, I would remember like seeing her videos, and it was so cool to me because I love anyone that is like super proud of their own skin and proud of what they like to do. And to me, especially being someone that I'm a geekier black guy or a nerdier black guy, and to kind of see how she like geeks out and is like super passionate about plants, like that's the same way that I am about like cats or anime. So like to see that passion just on display, but her actually giving like valid advice and, you know, like real things that are going to help people hopefully avoid some problematic situations if they do need to, for any reason, use those survival tactics, you know, out in the wild. So I love to see that, and I love that she's definitely making that social networking, you know, connection with people out there, because here we are talking about her without even having that conversation prior to. So I definitely love to hear that. But thank you, like, overall, for sharing your story behind AgFro. I know there are certainly going to be some individuals in the audience touched by your passion and your story thus far. And I have to ask, though, knowing that you recently just went an internship working on a farm, was there any aspects of the job that surprised you, or you felt like your classroom studies didn't prepare you for, that you could have possibly maybe saw stem from your background rather than your skills or your current expertise?
I would say, okay, so the classroom definitely told us, hey, farm work is hard work, especially with taking that sustainable agriculture class twice. We had to manually pull the weeds out, or we had to hoe the weeds out. And doing it 2 hours on Tuesday and Thursday is nothing like doing it for 8 hours Monday to Friday.
Yeah.
So, but then again, I worked at FedEx, and I would do 8 hours Monday to Friday. So it was similar, but it wasn't the same. And honestly, it was hot. It was it was hot. It was 90 degrees outside. It was 105 in the greenhouse. And we were watering plants. I mean, I remember talking to my grandma, and she's like, you know what, you would never know this, but me and my mom would, you know, make the garden and tend to the garden and harvest everything. And she's one of 14. And she's still alive. She's 86. She lives in Houston, and Houston is hot too. But she was like, yeah, but I'm glad to see that you and your dad are doing that, and that's what you're going to school for. Because
Mhm.
I'm the spitting image of my grandma, so I feel like I'm just her, but modernized. Everyone's like, "Oh, you look so much like your grandma," and I'm just like, "I don't see it." And I'm like, "No, I see it now. Yep,
Okay.
I see it now."
No, that's awesome. I feel like some of those things we definitely have to grow into, and it takes some time to really figure out where our footing is and kind of who we are and what mold we kind of took. So I definitely appreciate that. And I know, like, with the heat and everything like that, it can definitely be excruciating. And I think you even had to deal with some of the Canadian wildfires just because I believe, remind me again, you were working out of Pennsylvania?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, and with all of that and having to deal with, I guess, the heat, the new, I guess, the newness of the job with, that internship actually kind of solidifying, if anything, just the opportunity for you to, as the young kids say, touch grass and really get that kind of with your roots out there. Do you think there's anything you would have changed about that experience, or anything that you would have, I guess, wanted that you didn't get out of it?
You know what? Not really, because what I feel like I didn't learn one place, I learned something else, and every experience, my grandma says, every experience, as long as you learn something, it's a good experience. And you know what? I did learn something, so that means it was a good experience. We had to deal with the Canadian wildfires because there was a couple days that the smog was so thick you couldn't tell what was smog and what was clouds. There was no sun for a couple days. Imagine it just being blue skies, clear, everything's cool. It was hot, but everything's cool. Boom, no sun. It's gray. And I'm used to it being gray. In Ohio, it's gray 200 days out of the year, so
Mm-hmm.
we we get used to it, but it was not, the plants were not having it. They were not
Mm-hmm.
having it. They were kind of laying down. They were getting water stressed. It was humid, and when it's humid and you sweat, you feel like you're wearing a wet blanket. How do you think the plants feel? So, um, I digress. But yeah, the fires was not fun to deal with, and people were getting lightheaded. People had to stop working. We were in the greenhouse, and it's kind of indoors, it's not really because the sidewalls are down and the doors, the front
I
and
was gonna
back,
say
is
you said
open.
it was hotter in the greenhouse
Oh
than it
yeah,
was outside.
it's
Yeah.
a glass box. You are standing in a giant glass box, and you are roasting like a potato. That is exactly what it is. But honestly, I was catcher all the time. I was catcher for 7 years when I was a kid, so I'm used to being under the sun,
Mm-hmm.
behind home plate for long periods of time. Like we were always outside, so that really didn't bother me. The heat didn't bother me either. Not that much, but yeah, it was crazy. I mean, it rained a few times. That we had raccoons in our. Oh, we had raccoons and we had deer at one point. They were, I guess, back behind some of the berries that we were growing, but and groundhogs, they're everywhere.
Hmm. Okay. No, so I guess hearing all of that, especially with your story, just being at the farm, if anything, more power to you because I don't know that I could make it on the farm. That's one of those where I know, I guess, what skills I have, and I'm still trying to get that party ultimately of all of the friends along this journey because I know that I'm going to need those skills. I know we've talked a little bit about maybe me growing some leafy greens of my own here in my apartment, but I think it's going to be some time before I actually take up that mantle. I don't have a green thumb just yet, but we're going to try and change that together. Um, Now, I do just, if anything, don't want to get too dark in the cast, but I do want to talk about a little bit of my fears for the future when I talk about the climate change issues and all of the Canadian wildfires. I mean, just this morning, we were actually talking about some of the wildfires that happened in Maui. And I'm curious, with your background in agriculture, what do you see, I guess, as the ultimate challenge moving forward in addressing climate change, especially as we think about not just the individuals impacted, lives taken and just whole communities being devastated, but also the very realistic thought of what could happen to our food chain at the end of the day if we aren't able to sustain crops for a variety of reasons, be it that supply lines dry up or we don't have the viable land to grow these crops in because of all of the wildfires and all of the issues stemming from climate change. I'm just curious, like as a student about to graduate in that field, what are your thoughts on that?
Honestly, I remember talking to my dad about this, and I said, well, in the only advice I could think of, I said, well, why don't they build a moat? And I was being completely serious. And I said, well, why don't you build a moat? If you're going to put out a fire, you got to smother it. If you build a moat so wide and the fire gets to that soil, you're going to get down to clay, and clay's usually pretty wet. And you could just take all of that soil you dug up and dump it on the fire and smother it. I mean, you could do it in patches, and that's probably a better idea, but it's just, that, and if that doesn't work, at least it's something. Mm-hmm. And I guess the fear comes from no one's communicating with anybody to see, hey, where are you guys at? Are you want some help? Even though the United States and Canada are two sovereign countries, we're all part of the same continent, and we should all work together. Be like, hey, that could potentially spread to us. Mm-hmm. We can help you. We're the same continent. We're all human beings. Let's try to patch this up. But I think this all stems from when there were, I can't remember if there were fires or if they bulldozed it. I want to say it was fires in the Amazon rainforest because they wanted to make way for livestock.
So those, I don't know if I know there were fires in the Amazon, but also there has been a lot of essentially illegal logging happening in the rainforest. Now, they say that it was to clear, paths for livestock, but at the end of the day, that timber is very expensive. So there have been a lot of organizations that have been involved in essentially illegal practices of logging, not just for that livestock area, but simply to take wood from the Amazon.
Yeah, it's just kind of sad to see that we depend on the earth for so much stuff, and we could be doing so much good. If you want to rip a tree out, plant 5 trees before you take 1 tree out. Mm-hmm. Trees take 15 years is probably 10 to 15 years is probably a good average. They take that long to produce enough timber for them to be worth anything. But if you cut them all down and you don't replace them, by the time you cut down all the trees, you haven't planted any trees. It's the Lorax. It's crazy to see how that book is so accurate. And it's kind of sad to see it go on this way. I mean, now whole islands are getting devastated, like Hawaii. It's... Mm-hmm.
I think that there's a lot of unforeseen consequences, though. Even when you talk about the American continent and, the North American continent, and essentially how we are not taking things seriously until it gets to our backyard. Like the Canadian wildfires, until we were having air quality alerts, it wasn't something serious that, was an American issue. It was just a Canadian wildfire. But we now see, those Canadian wildfires cause for air quality issues for a multitude of states, a multitude of counties, a multitude of cities. And essentially, we could have done something to help Canada to prevent that from, essentially leaching out into the states into the first place. But we're just very reactive in this country. So it's one of those, well, once it hits us, we're going to do something about it because we're forced to. But we shouldn't have to be forced to do something.
We should be proactive.
Absolutely. I think that even when we talk about, and I know some people will get up in arms when I say this, but the coronavirus, there were coronaviruses in Africa going on for a long time before essentially the COVID-19, like as we saw it, got to the States. Now, granted, COVID-19 in the way that it was mutated, that was at this point still arguably something that they believe came from China. But like I said before, COVID-19 is not the first coronavirus that appeared. So there were other coronaviruses, but we didn't really take them seriously because they happen in African, essentially African nations, and it was just like, well, it's not going to get to us here. We won't have to deal with this. Had we taken that seriously, I'm not saying that we would have been able to prevent all of the deaths from COVID-19 and that specific mutation, but we would have already had, certain vaccinations and certain, I guess, medical needs and desires already in the thought process and in our minds had we been addressing the needs of the African people when they were asking for help, rather than saying, hey, we're going to worry about that if and when it gets to us. And it's no different than climate change, but the thing is, climate change, it's a global phenomenon. It's a global issue. We can't sit here and be like, oh, well, we don't know why. And ultimately, those wildfires happen in Maui. We can't say that, like, oh, well, I guess there was the hurricane draft from Hurricane Dora that helped contribute to those fires. But it's just like, well, why is Hurricane Dora, like hurricane season, getting worse and worse? And it's like all of these little small factors that you can, like, point to this, that, and the third. But as a whole, it points to this bigger picture of climate change that, again, we, at least here in the States, I believe that there are definitely more countries that are kind of being reactive to it. But here in the States, we're being really reactive to issues that, at the end of the day, we know who we're causing them too. Like, I think that also needs to be said. There are a lot of large corporations that know at this point they've paid researchers to basically to have them say, you're engaging in practices that aren't sustainable. Like, this is harming the environment, and they're still looking at their corporate, paychecks, and it's just like, oh, well, at the end of the day, as long as we can live to see the end of the day, it doesn't matter about the generations that are left to come. So when you talk about, like, planting trees that, like, 15 years later, there's not going to be another tree, well, 15 years later, there might not be someone to sell that tree to, so why does it matter?
That's
so
very true.
It's one of those where it scares me because this is the route that we're going on. Like, this is the route that we're taking, especially being a young man. So I'm only 25, and when I ask other, 20-year-olds, like, their thoughts on these things, it's more so, how do you see it if you intend to have a future generation? Because even if, things do continue down the path that it's going, I might still be able to see my 60s, 70s, 80s, fingers crossed. But when I think about any child that would come before, like, after me, I don't know that they're guaranteed that 60, 70, 80 years. Like, not because they wouldn't be able to survive that, but because I don't know that our Earth is going to make it that long.
Yeah, and that is a valid fear. Honestly, it's crazy to see what's happened since we were children, not just with climate change, with technology, with literally everything. I don't know if you remember the outbreak of swine flu. But Sharice and I were children, and she got swine flu, and I took care of her. I never got it. And it was similar. A lot of kids were getting sick. A lot of kids were dying from this virus. And it's kind of like it's not the first time the human race has experienced something like this. By now, we should have some sort of protocol that goes into place. Hey, there's this wild virus going on. We could figure out where it came from. But this is what we have to do to make sure we can get it vaccinated, contained, and wiped out. Honestly, you have all these movies that go through X, Y, Z, and then, something like this actually happens, and the world stops. So it's kind of crazy. But on the other hand, with climate change, that's also frightening because with the wildfires, we don't know exactly what that's going to do. I mean, we do understand that when the earth was first created, volcanoes erupted, created the continent, and then the continent broke apart, shifted, became continents plural. So we don't know if that's going to create a chain reaction with the weather. Last year in December during Christmas time, it was negative 20 degrees. I don't remember the last time it was that cold, but it was that cold, and it snowed, and it rained before it snowed. It was not pleasant to deal with. But then again, with extreme heat also comes extreme cold. It's climate change. It's not People get global warming and climate change kind of intertwined and mixed up. Global warming is a side effect of climate change, but the other side of that is freezing temperatures where there shouldn't be. Now, is it possible that all the ice caps are going to melt by the time you and I are in our 70s, 80s? I don't know. But we don't know what the byproduct of these fires is going to do, you know? Mm-hmm. We burned off part of the Earth's lungs, essentially, and it's frightening. It is frightening. But I do hold hope that we as people, as human beings, can come together and actually try to figure out solutions. We should not have to war with each other, because I joke with my dad. I'm like, Dad, if aliens were to come and invade the whole planet, they wouldn't care about our race. They would just look at us all as human beings. So why are we putting ourselves on these pedestals and being like, oh, we're so different? I'm like, no, we just look different. I mean, a whole bunch of dogs look different, but they're a whole bunch of dogs. A whole bunch of cats look different, but they're a whole bunch of cats. I mean, a whole bunch of humans look different, but we're a whole bunch of humans. We're all Homo sapiens. Mm-hmm. We're not this like race of a whole bunch of, no, we're the human race. That's what we are, and it's so messed up that we get hung up on our differences of what we look like. It's just, it's just sad. It's just sad.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Even though that's sad, and I will agree that it is very sad that we get hung up on those differences, while we can't necessarily do much in terms of the differences other than having dialogues, making sure that we're talking with each other and humanizing each other, in the realm of agriculture, I want to really end this podcast on a positive note. What are 3 things that we can do today to impact change for the better? Be it, opportunities of eating locally with our farmers markets here. Be it, actually trying to grow, like I know you pointed to me, just growing my own leafy greens, saving some money while also eating healthier. Or even just some tips or tricks if you don't have the space for growing plants, but you might want to get into it. Just off the top of your head, 3 things that we can do to really better ourselves and to better our planet, so that maybe that next generation can be a little bit further along than they're currently on the route to be.
I think that's a great question. First, I would say try to plant something in your yard if you have the space that's edible. I know a lot of my dad's neighbors have mint growing in their yards. Okay. And mint, once you plant it, it just runs with it. It'll spread everywhere. But if you have a small plot of land, you could put it in a bucket. Bury the bucket halfway down and then put the mint in, because you can see where the runners are going if they go out of the bucket. And it won't go deeper than the bucket. It won't, spread through the soil. So that's one thing. Another thing, if you go to farmers markets, I would also just talk to people in the garden section. Or like join a group that likes to grow, like a blog of people that just likes to grow stuff. Just talk to random people. The class I was in was so diverse, but we all got along because we were all a bunch of nerds. So it was just, it was a great class. We were all a bunch of nerds growing a bunch of plants, and we were all just goofing off. But it was really fun, and it brought us all together, and we're even friends now because of that class. So yeah, just talk to people. I think because agriculture inspires communication. Mm-hmm. And third of all, if you don't have the space to grow, what I would do is look into local community gardens because there's usually spaces you can get a space $15 for the whole summer or something cheap, and it's already has soil in it. So what I did when we had a community garden when we lived in New Albany, I got 2 bags of soil, put it down on top of, and I dug out all the weeds. I hand pulled the weeds out, and put the soil down. Um, watered it in. Had a tomato transplant. Had, I think, a couple other things. The peppers didn't grow, so we replaced them with cucumbers, and I grew a cucumber as big as my foot.
Okay, all right.
And for those of you who don't know how big my feet are, I wear like a 10.5 in men's. So it was huge. We got a whole bunch of tomatoes that year. I mean, it was a good year. But just a community garden, and if you don't have the space, there's space for you, and they usually have like access to water. You can get to know the people there as well. You can trade food, or if you live in a community where you can grow something, get to know your neighbors and see if you can't trade food. I know a lot of times people have a whole bunch of extra tomatoes or a whole bunch of extra peppers. They're like, hey, you want this, you want this, you want this? Go to cookouts. Heck, bring the extra stuff that you have from your house to cookouts. Someone will cook it up and it'll be great. So, but we just need to get back to being with each other. I think COVID separated us a little bit, and agriculture is a great way to do that. It's rigorous and it's tiring, but it is so rewarding. And that's the best part about it.
All right. Well, thank you. If anything, Sansare, thank you again for that perspective, because it is not often enough we get to hear such a refreshing and down-to-earth conversation pertaining to agriculture, especially between two individuals of color. And I really feel like you've helped connect myself and our listeners to some of our roots. So, as always, I've been your host, Marius Lancaster, and thank you for listening. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and never stop seeking the truth.